Hey there, tonight we're diving into the shadow-soaked corners of ancient Egypt, not to marvel at gleaming pyramids or golden masks, but to explore something darker, stranger. While Egypt gave us mathematical wonders, hieroglyphic beauty, and a cosmic obsession with the afterlife, it also perfected the art of punishment in ways that would make even the most hardened modern prison warden wince and reach for their resignation letter. The land of the pharaohs wasn't just about building monuments to eternity, it was about maintaining order through carefully calculated pain. These weren't random acts of cruelty. They were theater, elaborate performances designed to restore Ma'at, the cosmic balance that governed Egyptian life. But these performances came with real blood, real screams, and consequences that followed victims into the afterlife itself. Before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining our midnight journey through history's darkest corridors. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on that fan for some gentle white noise, and let's ease into tonight's exploration of ancient Egypt's most bizarre punishments. The Egyptians believed life was merely a brief prelude to an eternal afterlife. Therefore, their punishments weren't just designed to end life, but to complicate your journey into the next world. A criminal in Egypt didn't just fear death, they feared something much worse: spiritual annihilation. Imagine standing before a stone-faced judge, your fate hanging on his words. But this isn't just about prison time or community service. The verdict might determine whether your soul can ever find peace. The stakes couldn't be higher. We're talking eternal consequences here, not just a few uncomfortable years in a cell with basic cable and mystery meat Tuesdays. Egyptian justice wasn't known for second chances. Their punishments reflected a society where order wasn't just preferred, it was sacred, cosmically mandated. The goddess Ma'at, with her ostrich feather of truth, didn't believe in rehabilitation programs or anger management classes. She demanded consequences, often permanent ones, written in scar tissue and missing body parts. You might think our modern justice system is harsh, but at least your judge won't order your nose cut off for stealing a loaf of bread, or have you thrown into a specially designed boat filled with angry animals just because you fudged your taxes. Although, I've had IRS auditors who seemed like they were considering the boat option. What made Egyptian punishments particularly fascinating wasn't just their creativity in causing pain, it was their obsession with symbolism. Every cut, every mutilation, every death had meaning. Your punishment wasn't just designed to hurt, it was crafted to tell a story. If you betrayed the pharaoh, your body might be positioned to mirror your crime. If you offended a particular god, that deity's sacred animal might deliver your sentence. Cosmic poetry written in suffering. And forget any notion of private punishment. In Egypt, justice was a public spectacle. Imagine your worst mistake broadcast on every social media platform simultaneously. Except instead of angry comments, you'd face actual physical consequences while everyone watched. Think of it as ancient Egypt's version of cancel culture, but with significantly more permanent results than just losing your Twitter verification. Criminals weren't just punished, they were transformed into living warnings. A man with his nose cut off became a walking billboard that screamed, "Don't steal." A woman with her ears removed broadcast, "Don't spy on the pharaoh's business." These weren't just penalties, they were advertisements for obedience etched into human flesh. The most terrifying aspect, however, wasn't the physical pain. It was what these punishments meant for your eternal soul. Egyptians believed proper burial and body preservation were essential for the afterlife. Therefore, many punishments deliberately interfered with this journey. Some criminals weren't just killed, they were erased, their names struck from monuments, their bodies desecrated, their path to eternity blocked. So as we explore these 12 bizarre punishments from ancient Egypt, remember, we're not just looking at methods of causing pain. We're examining a culture that believed justice extended beyond death, where your punishment could follow you for eternity. A place where losing your nose wasn't just embarrassing, it was a spiritual catastrophe. Think about that the next time you complain about a parking ticket. At least the officer didn't feed you to sacred crocodiles while priests chanted your crimes to the god Sobek. Though I've seen some meter maids in downtown Chicago who looked like they were considering it. Let's begin our journey through ancient Egypt's most bizarre punishments, where justice wasn't just blind, it was meticulously calculated, elaborately staged, and cosmically eternal. Because in the land of the pharaohs, your worst day in court wouldn't end with community service. It might end with you missing body parts, sealed in a boat with angry animals, or erased so completely that even the gods would forget your name. Let's begin our dark journey with a punishment that strikes at the very center of your face. In ancient Egypt, your nose wasn't just for breathing or smelling the lotus blossoms along the Nile. It was the seat of your identity, your breath, your life force itself. And your ears? They weren't just for hearing the morning calls of temple priests or the flowing waters. They were how you received divine instruction, how you connected to the voices of the gods themselves. Which is precisely why removing these features made for such a perfect punishment. When an Egyptian judge decreed nose or ear removal, they weren't just causing pain, they were rewriting your identity. Imagine walking through the marketplace afterward, every face turning to look at the hollow where your nose once proudly sat. Children would point, merchants would whisper, and everyone would know exactly what you had done. These weren't random mutilations. They were carefully designed marks of shame, each corresponding to a specific crime. Nose removal was typically reserved for liars, adulterers, and those who betrayed trust. The symbolism couldn't be clearer. You had lost your sense of direction, your ability to smell out the right path. A beautiful woman caught in adultery might find herself noseless, her beauty permanently marred as a reminder of her crime. In a society obsessed with perfect forms and harmony, this disfigurement was devastating. Your mutilated face became a living hieroglyph that everyone could read. Ear removal, meanwhile, was the punishment for spies, eavesdroppers, and those who failed to follow instructions. The poetic justice is striking. You used your ears to hear what wasn't meant for you, so those ears were taken away. Or perhaps you failed to listen to commands or warnings, so what use were your ears anyway? Some scribes recorded cases where only one ear was removed for minor offenses, with the threat that the other would follow if the lesson wasn't learned. Archaeological evidence confirms these weren't just threats. Mummies have been discovered with nasal cavities that show signs of deliberate cutting rather than natural decomposition. The famous Eloquent Peasant papyrus mentions nose cutting as a standard punishment, described with the casual familiarity of something everyone knew about. One particularly grim tomb painting from the New Kingdom shows a line of prisoners, several missing noses, being led before the pharaoh. These mutilations were performed with specialized copper tools, blades designed specifically for judicial punishment, rather than medical procedures. The cut would be quick but agonizing, with nothing to dull the pain except perhaps a strong drink of beer beforehand, if the executioner was feeling merciful. Blood control was a serious concern. Some records suggest the wounds were immediately cauterized with hot irons to prevent excessive bleeding, adding another layer of excruciating pain to the process. But here's where Egyptian punishments truly differed from other ancient cultures. They weren't just about the physical pain, they were about what happened after. Unlike Rome, where criminals might be killed and forgotten, or Greece, where exile might offer a fresh start elsewhere, Egyptian criminals had to live with their punishment. Every morning, when they washed their face in the Nile waters, they'd see their reflection, permanently altered, permanently marked. Every social interaction became a moment of shame. Every introduction was preceded by the silent explanation of their mutilated features. And worse still were the spiritual implications. Egyptians believed the body needed to be complete for the afterlife journey. The famous Book of the Dead contains spells specifically designed to magically restore body parts lost during life. But those who suffered judicial mutilation faced a terrifying question. Would these magical spells work for parts deliberately removed as punishment? Many feared they wouldn't, that their disfigurement would follow them into eternity. Consider the case of Paneb, a workman from Deir el-Medina during the 19th dynasty. According to surviving papyri, he was accused of multiple crimes including theft and adultery. Historical records suggest he lost his nose as punishment, forcing him to wear an artificial nose made of wax or wood, an expensive solution available only to those with means. For the rest, a cloth covering or simply enduring the stares was their only option. What's particularly fascinating is how these punishments evolved over time. During the Old Kingdom, nose and ear removal seems to have been reserved for the most serious offences. By the New Kingdom, they had become more common, with different gradations of severity. A noble might lose just the tip of the nose, while a commoner could lose the entire appendage. There was a cruel bureaucracy to disfigurement, a hierarchy of humiliation. Egypt wasn't alone in using facial mutilation as punishment. Assyrians, Persians, and later civilizations adopted similar practices. But Egypt refined it into an art form, a calculated system where the punishment perfectly mirrored the crime. A thief might lose a hand, but a liar lost their nose, the body part most associated with breath, which carried your words. For women, the punishment carried additional weight. In a culture where beauty was celebrated and immortalized in art, facial disfigurement was particularly devastating. Some records suggest that women who lost their noses were effectively removed from society, unable to marry or participate in normal community life. Their punishment extended far beyond the physical pain of the cutting. It was a social death sentence. Think about that next time you tell a small white lie. In ancient Egypt, that fib might have cost you the center of your face. Your friends wouldn't just judge you. They'd see the physical manifestation of your dishonesty every time they looked at you. No second chances, no reputation recovery, just a lifetime of explaining your missing features to everyone you met. The procedure itself was performed with clinical efficiency. The convicted would be held down, often in public, their head secured by assistants. The cutting blade, a special copper knife with a curved edge, would make quick work of cartilage and flesh. Some hieroglyphic accounts suggest the removed parts were sometimes displayed publicly afterward, perhaps nailed to a post or gateway as a warning to others. By the late period of ancient Egypt, these punishments had become so ingrained in the justice system that they were categorized with specific terms in legal texts. Different degrees of nasal mutilation carried different legal weights. Partial removal might allow for eventual reintegration into society, while complete removal marked you forever as an outcast. What's perhaps most chilling is that these punishments weren't considered particularly extreme by Egyptian standards. They were routine, mundane even, the standardized response to specific crimes. There were far worse fates awaiting those who committed more serious offenses against Pharaoh or the gods. Nose and ear removal was simply Egypt's version of a misdemeanor penalty, painful, permanent, but at least you lived to feel the shame. So next time you walk past security cameras or worry about your privacy online, remember that in ancient Egypt, the punishment for eavesdropping wasn't a fine or a warning. It was having your ears physically removed, your face forever altered, and your social status permanently diminished. Not to mention the distinct possibility that this mutilation might follow you into the afterlife, where explaining yourself to Osiris with a missing nose would certainly complicate your journey through eternity. As we move from facial mutilation to our next punishment, remember, in Egypt, justice wasn't just served. It was carved directly into your flesh, turning your body into a walking testament to your crimes. And some carvings went much, much deeper than just the surface. If facial mutilation was Egypt's way of marking minor offenders, impalement was how they dealt with those who shook the very foundations of Ma'at itself. Where a missing nose might make you an outcast, impalement made you a spectacle, a horrifying human exhibition of what happens when you cross the divine order of Pharaoh's realm. As we venture deeper into Egypt's dark catalogue of punishments, we move from disfigurement to destruction, from shame to excruciating annihilation. Impalement wasn't just execution. It was messaging written in agony, a brutal billboard advertising the consequences of challenging the cosmic order. The mechanics were deceptively simple, but meticulously calculated for maximum suffering. A sharpened wooden stake, often cedar, imported from Lebanon for important executions, would be driven through the victim's body. But unlike the quick thrust we might imagine, Egyptian impalement was a slower, more methodical process. The stake would typically enter through the rectum or abdomen and be carefully maneuvered to avoid vital organs, ensuring the condemned remained alive and conscious as long as possible, sometimes for days. Think of it as the opposite of mercy. Every breath, every heartbeat, every moment of consciousness was another moment of unimaginable pain, and all of it public, all of it visible, all of it a lesson etched in flesh and blood. Impalement was reserved primarily for what Egyptians considered the most serious offenses: treason against the pharaoh, temple robbery, tomb desecration, and rebellion. These weren't just crimes against people or property, they were attacks on the divine order itself. When you stole from a temple, you weren't just taking gold, you were stealing from the gods. When you rebelled against Pharaoh, you weren't just challenging a ruler, you were disrupting the cosmic balance maintained by Ma'at herself. One of the most detailed accounts comes from the reign of Amenhotep II in the 18th dynasty. After quelling a rebellion in the Levant, he returned to Egypt with 7 Syrian princes. According to hieroglyphic records at Karnak, he personally impaled 6 of these princes on the walls of Thebes, their bodies displayed like grim trophies for all to see. The 7th was taken to Napata in Nubia and impaled there, spreading the message of Pharaoh's wrath across the empire's southern frontier. This wasn't just cruelty, it was calculated political theatre. The location of the impalement mattered as much as the act itself. Rebels were often impaled near city gates, ensuring everyone entering or leaving would witness the consequences of challenging authority. Temple robbers might be staked outside the very temple they had violated, their suffering becoming an offering of sorts to the offended deity. Archaeological evidence of impalement is, understandably, difficult to confirm. Human remains rarely preserve the specific trauma patterns that would definitively prove impalement as cause of death. However, tomb paintings and relief carvings leave little doubt about the practice. A particularly vivid scene from the tomb of Horemheb shows foreign captives being impaled while still alive, their bodies contorted in agony, Egyptian soldiers standing guard to ensure no one offers mercy. What made Egyptian impalement particularly horrifying was its religious dimension. Remember, Egyptians believed the intact preservation of the body was essential for the afterlife journey. Impalement not only destroyed the body, but did so in a way that was spiritually catastrophic. The stake prevented proper mummification, ensuring the victim's soul, their ka and ba, would wander restlessly, unable to complete the journey to the field of reeds. Consider the case of Pentuere, a prince implicated in the harem conspiracy against Ramesses III. Historical records suggest he was given the choice between impalement and suicide. He chose the latter, not out of fear of physical pain, but because suicide might allow proper funerary rites afterward. Impalement wasn't just death, it was spiritual obliteration. For the Egyptians, impalement also carried symbolic weight tied directly to their mythology. The stake penetrating the body mirrored how Set had pierced his brother Osiris in Egyptian creation myths. But where Osiris was eventually restored by Isis, allowing him to rule the underworld, those judicially impaled had no divine sister to piece them back together. Their fragmentation was permanent, their afterlife denied. The process itself was conducted with the same bureaucratic precision that characterized all aspects of Egyptian society. Special officials oversaw the execution, ensuring it was performed correctly. The wood used was often ceremonially prepared, sometimes inscribed with the victim's crimes or religious texts, emphasizing the restoration of Ma'at through this punishment. Nothing in Egypt was without ritual, not even its most brutal executions. Impalement wasn't unique to Egypt, of course. The Assyrians, Persians, and later the Romans all employed variations of this punishment. But Egypt's version was distinctive in its spiritual dimensions and its precise methodology. It wasn't just about causing pain or death. It was about erasing someone completely, denying them both earthly dignity and afterlife existence. The psychological impact on the population cannot be overstated. Imagine walking to market and passing a human being skewered vertically, still moaning, flies buzzing around their wounds, their eyes following you as you hurry past. Now imagine knowing that this person might remain there for days, their suffering prolonged intentionally as a lesson to all. Even the most loyal subject would think twice before breaking Pharaoh's laws after witnessing such a scene. Foreign visitors to Egypt recorded their horror at these displays. A Hittite diplomatic message mentions the terrible stake punishment of the Egyptians and advises their king to avoid provoking Pharaoh at all costs. Greek historians later wrote of the practice with a mixture of fascination and revulsion, noting how matter-of-factly Egyptians treated what seemed to outsiders an exceptionally barbaric form of execution. But perhaps most chilling are the administrative papyri that mention impalement alongside mundane governmental matters: tax collection, grain storage, and festival planning. One fragmentary document from the 19th dynasty lists 3 stakes prepared for the rebels, alongside requisitions for temple lamps and payment for court musicians, as though ordering execution equipment was no more remarkable than ordering office supplies. During times of political instability, impalement became more common. The Second Intermediate Period and the late Ramesside era saw spikes in recorded impalements as threatened rulers sought to reinforce their authority through spectacular displays of power. One particularly dark period during the reign of Seti saw an entire village impaled after harboring escaped prisoners, their bodies left in place until nothing remained but bones and wooden stakes, a grim forest of consequences. The punishment wasn't always immediately fatal. Egyptian physicians sometimes noted how long victims survived, a macabre record-keeping that served both practical and symbolic purposes. A strong criminal who survived for many days might be seen as particularly guilty, their extended suffering necessary to balance their greater crime against Ma'at. These observations were recorded and studied, adding to Egypt's extensive medical knowledge. What's particularly fascinating is how impalement in Egypt wasn't seen as cruel by those administering it, merely necessary. The same culture that produced exquisite art, profound philosophy, and remarkable medicine saw no contradiction in maintaining such brutal punishments. To them, removing a cancerous threat to cosmic order was as necessary as removing a tumor from the body, painful but essential for continued health. As Egypt's influence spread throughout the ancient Mediterranean, so too did knowledge of their punishment practices. Neighboring kingdoms either adopted similar methods or specifically avoided them to distinguish themselves culturally. Some regions advertised more merciful justice systems as a selling point to attract Egyptian citizens unhappy with their homeland's harsh penalties. By the late period, as Egypt fell under Persian and later Greek influence, impalement became less common, though it never disappeared entirely. Foreign rulers found other ways to maintain control, often using punishments more familiar to their own cultures. Yet the memory of the stake remained potent in Egyptian consciousness, a symbol of ultimate authority and ultimate consequences. So next time you complain about a harsh penalty for breaking some minor rule, remember that in ancient Egypt, challenging authority didn't end with a fine or a stern lecture. It ended with you becoming a living monument to Pharaoh's power, your body transformed into a warning sign, your suffering measured in days rather than moments, and your afterlife chances completely obliterated. Even the modern world's harshest justice systems at least stop punishing you after death. But impalement, for all its horror, still allowed the public to see your face, to know who you were, to remember your name. Some Egyptian punishments went further, using animals as instruments of divine justice. And few creatures carried more religious significance or more deadly potential than the massive horned beasts we'll explore next. For certain criminals, death would come not on a stake, but beneath the hooves of sacred creatures, connecting their punishment directly to the gods they had offended. From the wooden stake of impalement We move to punishments, where Egyptians enlisted the divine directly, through the hooves and horns of creatures considered earthly manifestations of the gods themselves. If impalement was a message from Pharaoh, being trampled by sacred oxen was a verdict delivered by deities in physical form. The red oxen of Egypt weren't just farm animals or beasts of burden. They were living connections to the divine realm, particularly associated with the god Apis, the bull deity of Memphis, and Minervis, the sacred bull of Heliopolis. These weren't ordinary cattle. They were carefully selected for specific markings, coloration, and temperament, then housed in temple complexes where they received treatment befitting their divine status. Using these sacred animals as instruments of execution wasn't just brutality, it was theological theater, a cosmic punishment where the gods themselves, through their bovine avatars, enacted justice upon the condemned. The process began with elaborate preparation. The convicted criminal, typically someone who had committed religious sacrilege, temple theft, or blasphemy against specific bull cults, would be ritually prepared. Their bodies would be painted with red ochre, the color associated with Egypt's hostile desert lands, and the chaos God set. Some papyri suggest they were fed special herbs intended not to sedate, but to agitate them, ensuring their movements would provoke the animals. Unlike modern bullfighting, where humans are the aggressors, in this punishment the human was the defenseless target. They would be secured in a temple courtyard or sacred enclosure, sometimes tied to a post with just enough rope to allow limited movement, sometimes simply thrown into an arena-like space with no escape possible. Then the sacred bulls, specially agitated through sound, scent, or by being withheld from food, would be released. What followed wasn't quick. Bull trampling could take minutes or hours depending on the animal's temperament and the specific ritual format. Some accounts describe the condemned being gored first, then trampled repeatedly as they lay wounded. Others suggest the victims were kept standing as long as possible, their suffering prolonged as a lesson to witnesses. Either way, death came through a combination of internal injuries, blood loss, and crushing trauma, all while priests chanted and onlookers witnessed divine judgment manifest in flesh and blood. Herodotus, that gossipy Greek historian who documented Egypt with equal parts fascination and horror, described one such execution during his travels. He wrote of a man who had killed a sacred Apis bull, accidentally he claimed, being brought before the replacement bull for judgment. According to Herodotus, the priests believed the sacred animal would recognize the guilty and exact divine retribution. Whether the bull was somehow trained to attack, or simply responded naturally to a terrified, ochre-painted human in its territory, remains a subject of scholarly debate. The religious significance cannot be overstated. Bulls in Egyptian theology represented fertility, strength, and divine protection. The Apis bull was considered the living incarnation of Ptah, later associated with Osiris. To be killed by such a creature wasn't just execution, it was direct judgment from the gods, bypassing even Pharaoh's authority. The victim's soul wasn't just being separated from their body, it was being rejected by the divine order itself. Artistic depictions of this punishment are rare compared to other forms of execution, perhaps because of its sacred nature. However, several temple reliefs show stylized versions of criminals beneath the hooves of bulls, their bodies contorted while priests observe from a safe distance. One particularly detailed scene from the Temple of Horus at Edfu shows a figure, labeled in hieroglyphs as the enemy of the god, being gored by a bull while Horus in human form looks on approvingly. The psychological impact of this punishment extended far beyond the physical suffering. Egyptians believed that how you died influenced your journey in the afterlife. Those who suffered natural or honorable deaths could hope for a smooth transition guided by Anubis. But those killed by sacred animals faced a more complicated spiritual fate. Some religious texts suggest they might be condemned to serve the animal deities in the afterlife, eternal servants to the very forces that executed them. Not every criminal faced the full-grown sacred bulls. a hierarchy of punishment existed, with graduated levels of severity. Lesser offenders might face younger animals or cows rather than bulls. Some might be made to run a gauntlet of cattle rather than being enclosed with a single enraged bull. As with all Egyptian punishments, there was bureaucracy and procedure even in brutality. The sound alone must have been terrifying. The snorting of agitated bulls, the panicked cries of the condemned, the rhythmic chanting of priests, all echoing off temple walls, designed for acoustic amplification. Witnesses described the ground shaking with each charge of the massive beasts, dust rising in clouds that gave the entire scene an otherworldly, apocalyptic quality. Most fascinating is how this punishment evolved over different periods of Egyptian history. During the Old Kingdom, records suggest it was reserved exclusively for those who directly defiled sacred bulls or their temples. By the New Kingdom, its use had expanded to include other religious offenses and even certain political crimes reframed as religious sacrilege. By the Ptolemaic period, Greek rulers had adapted the practice, blending Egyptian religious symbolism with Greek notions of public spectacle. The sacred nature of these executions meant they were often timed to coincide with religious festivals, particularly those honoring bull deities. Imagine the contrast: joyous celebration, offering, and worship, followed by the brutal divine judgment of criminals. This juxtaposition wasn't accidental, but intentional, reinforcing the dual nature of divine power, both nurturing and destructive, protective and punishing. For common Egyptians, witnessing such executions reinforced the absolute importance of religious compliance. The message was clear: the gods were not abstract concepts, but present forces with very real, very physical means of punishing transgression. The line between theological sin and painful death was direct and unmistakable. One account from the reign of Ramesses II describes a merchant who had sold defective incense to the temple of Ptah. After his fraud was discovered, he was condemned to the bulls. According to the record, kept by a temple scribe, the man survived the initial goring, only to be trampled repeatedly over nearly an hour. The scribe noted with evident satisfaction that this prolonged suffering confirmed the depth of his offense against the god. Foreign diplomats stationed in Egypt often wrote home about these rituals with horror and fascination. A Hittite document describes their diplomats being required to attend such an execution as part of treaty negotiations, a not-so-subtle reminder of Egyptian religious power. The Hittite observer noted that even hardened soldiers in their delegation turned away during the worst moments, while Egyptian children watched without flinching, already acculturated to their nation's brand of divine justice. The practical logistics of maintaining sacred bulls for both worship and execution created an entire economic ecosystem. Specialized priests cared for the animals, farmers grew specific feeds, and craftsmen created the ritual paraphernalia. One papyrus from the Third Intermediate period lists extensive temple properties dedicated solely to maintaining the bulls of justice, suggesting these animals served a specific judicial function separate from the main temple bulls. Modern forensic analysis of some preserved remains has identified trauma patterns consistent with bull trampling, multiple crush injuries, distinctive horn puncture wounds, and extensive post-mortem damage, suggesting the animals continued attacking even after death occurred. One particularly well-preserved mummy from the late period shows evidence of having been killed by a bull, though whether as punishment or accident cannot be determined with certainty. So the next time you find yourself frustrated with a stubborn cow or annoyed at a farmer's slow-moving herd blocking the road, remember that in ancient Egypt, those seemingly placid creatures were sometimes instruments of divine judgment, their hooves and horns serving as the physical manifestation of godly wrath. Your minor agricultural inconvenience would have been their spiritual cataclysm. But even sacred bulls offered a relatively quick, if painful, end. Some Egyptian punishments were designed to last much longer, to create a prolonged spectacle of judgment, where survival itself became part of the punishment, and few creatures inspired more religious awe or more primal fear than the divine reptiles who ruled the life-giving Nile. For some criminals, Judgment would come from the scaled jaws of gods who had been perfecting their deadly skills since the time of dinosaurs. From the thundering hooves of sacred bulls, we move to the silent, sinister glide of Egypt's most perfect predator, the crocodile. If the bull represented divine strength and power in its most direct form, the crocodile embodied something more ancient, more primordial. These living fossils had ruled the Nile since before the first pharaoh raised a monument, and Egyptians recognized in them a perfect blend of patience, power, and deadly precision. At the center of crocodile worship stood Sobek, the crocodile-headed god associated with pharaonic power, fertility, and military prowess. Temples dedicated to him dotted the Nile Valley, particularly in the Fayum region where crocodiles were especially numerous. These weren't just places of worship. They were living sanctuaries where sacred crocodiles were kept, adorned with gold jewelry, fed choice meats, and treated as divine incarnations. It was these pampered, deified reptiles that sometimes served as Egypt's most terrifying judges, juries, and executioners. Unlike many Egyptian punishments that were purely punitive, trial by crocodile had a distinctive feature. It sometimes offered the theoretical possibility of survival. I say theoretical because while survival was technically possible, it was about as likely as winning the lottery while being struck by lightning during a solar eclipse. The setup was deceptively simple. The accused, typically someone charged with crimes against the Nile, water theft during drought, river piracy, or desecration of crocodile sacred sites, would be brought to a specially designed portion of riverbank adjacent to a Sobek temple. Sometimes these were natural formations. Sometimes they were human-made basins connected to the river by channels that could be opened or closed. What followed was equal parts execution and divination. Priests would recite specific charges and prayers, calling upon Sobek to render judgment. The accused would then be placed in the water, sometimes bound partially, but with enough mobility to theoretically swim, sometimes fully mobile, but confined to the basin area. Then the sacred crocodiles would be released or called. If the crocodiles killed you, which happened in the overwhelming majority of cases, your guilt was confirmed. But if by some miracle you survived, either because the crocodiles ignored you or because you managed to evade them long enough for the priest to declare the trial complete, you were considered divinely acquitted. The god Sobek himself had deemed you innocent. One Greek account from the Ptolemaic period describes a man accused of stealing sacred offerings who was subjected to this trial. According to the witness, the man survived for nearly an hour, repeatedly dodging lunging crocodiles in chest-deep water while onlookers began to whisper that perhaps he was indeed innocent. Then, just as it seemed he might survive, a massive crocodile, described as the grandfather of all river beasts, surged from deeper water and dragged him under. The crowd reportedly roared its approval, seeing in this dramatic finale confirmation that justice had merely been building suspense. The psychological torture of this punishment cannot be overstated. Crocodiles are ambush predators known for their patience. A condemned person might stand in water for minutes or even hours, each ripple and shadow triggering fresh terror. Some accounts describe victims becoming so exhausted from fear and vigilance that they simply collapsed into the water, their bodies surrendering before the crocodiles even struck. The spectacle drew large crowds. Temple records mention viewing platforms constructed specifically for high-ranking witnesses, while common Egyptians would crowd the shoreline. Some temples even collected admission fees or offerings for premium viewing positions, turning divine justice into a macabre form of religious theater that helped finance temple operations. What made this punishment particularly significant was its connection to Egyptian beliefs about the river itself. The Nile wasn't just water. It was Egypt's lifeblood, a divine gift that made civilization possible in an otherwise harsh desert. Crimes against the river or its creatures were seen as threatening the entire nation's survival. When a crocodile pulled a criminal beneath the waters, it wasn't just executing an individual, it was protecting Egypt itself. Archaeological evidence supports the historical accounts. Several temple complexes dedicated to Sobek feature distinctive pools or channeled areas that align with descriptions of judgment basins. The crocodile mummies found at sites like Com Ombo include specimens of extraordinary size, some over 15 feet long, more than capable of performing their divine judicial duties. The sacred crocodiles themselves were carefully selected and maintained. Not just any river reptile could serve as Sobek's judgment instrument. Temple records describe crocodiles chosen for distinctive markings, unusual size, or particular aggressiveness. These animals would be ritually incorporated into the temple, sometimes raised from hatchlings specifically for religious purposes. They were fed special diets that, according to some sources, occasionally included portions of executed criminals, completing a grim cycle of divine justice. During the New Kingdom period, the practice evolved to include a preliminary trial phase. Before facing the crocodiles, the accused would undergo questioning while standing in gradually rising water. The belief was that the approaching threat would encourage truthful confession. Those who confessed might be granted a quicker death by conventional means. Those who maintained innocence proceeded to the full crocodile trial. The fate of survivors, those rare individuals spared by Sobek's scaly representatives, varied across different periods. In earlier dynasties, surviving the crocodile pit led to complete exoneration and sometimes elevation to special religious status. These fortunate few were considered touched by divine favor and might be incorporated into temple service. By the late period, however, survival merely commuted the sentence to exile or lesser punishment, as Greek-influenced rulers grew more skeptical of purely divine verdicts. One particularly fascinating case comes from a partial papyrus dating to Ramesses III's reign. It describes a tax collector accused of skimming from revenues destined for the Sobek temple at Crocodilopolis. After conventional investigation proved inconclusive, he faced the sacred crocodiles. According to the account, the man survived not just one but 3 separate immersions, leading the high priest to declare him not only innocent, but blessed. He was subsequently appointed to a position within the temple itself, a remarkable reversal of fortune that temple records suggested was unique in living memory. The geographic distribution of this punishment followed the cult of Sobek, concentrated particularly in Middle Egypt and the Fayum. In these regions, temple complexes maintained purpose-built facilities for crocodile trials, some capable of accommodating hundreds of spectators. The most elaborate, at Crocodilopolis, modern Fayum city, featured a series of graduated pools, allowing for different levels of exposure based on the severity of accusations. For foreign visitors, the crocodile trials represented Egyptian justice at its most alien and frightening. Persian accounts describe diplomatic missions being required to witness these proceedings, presumably as both cultural education and subtle intimidation. One Assyrian observer noted with evident discomfort how Egyptian children watched the proceedings with fascination rather than fear, suggesting a cultural comfort with this form of divine judgment that outsiders found disturbing. The ritual aspects were as important as the practical ones. Before facing the crocodiles, the accused would be purified through washing with natron, the same mineral used in mummification, symbolically preparing them for either divine judgment or journey to the afterlife. Their bodies would be anointed with specific oils. Some accounts suggest these might have included scents, either attractive or repellent to crocodiles, allowing priests some influence over the outcome while maintaining the appearance of divine judgment. Seasonality played a role as well. Crocodile trials were more common during the inundation season, when the Nile flooded, and crocodiles were naturally more active and aggressive. This timing reinforced the connection between river, deity, and justice, as the same floods that brought life-giving silt also brought divine judgment to wrongdoers. By the Ptolemaic period, the practice had become somewhat theatrical, with condemned criminals sometimes placed on small floating platforms that would gradually sink, creating a grim countdown to the inevitable crocodile attack. Greek accounts describe these platforms as being shaped like miniature boats, reinforcing the symbolic journey to judgment. So the next time you visit a zoo's reptile house and watch crocodiles lounging motionless behind glass, remember that in ancient Egypt, these efficient predators weren't just animals. They were divine instruments of justice, their powerful jaws the physical manifestation of Sobek's judgment. That lazy-looking reptile sunning itself might, in another time and place, have been adorned with gold, fed choice meats, and tasked with sending proven criminals to a watery afterlife. But while sacred bulls and divine crocodiles delivered judgment through tooth and claw, some Egyptian punishments were more subtle, more calculated, more internally devastating. For certain offenders, particularly those of high rank who couldn't be subjected to public spectacle without political consequences, judgment came not from animal attacks, but from carefully prepared substances, administered in controlled settings where the only witnesses were the walls themselves. In these chambers of poisonous justice, death arrived not with a roar or a splash, but with the quiet inevitability of a slow-spreading shadow. From the public spectacle of crocodile judgment, we turn now to something more intimate, more secretive, death behind closed doors. While common criminals might face their end at the horns of a bull or jaws of a crocodile, for the elite, for the royal, for those whose station demanded a certain dignity even in punishment, Egypt developed something more refined, the poison chamber. Don't let the relative privacy fool you. This was not mercy. This was calculated chemistry applied with religious precision, turning the vast botanical knowledge of Egyptian medicine toward ending life rather than preserving it. The Egyptians weren't just master architects and theologians, they were also sophisticated pharmacologists. The same civilization that pioneered complex surgical techniques and extensive herbal remedies also catalogued hundreds of toxic substances. The Edwin Smith and Eber's papyri, primarily medical texts, contain detailed information about poisons alongside their healing counterparts, evidence of a culture that understood the knife-edge relationship between medicine and toxicology. The poison chamber itself was typically a specially designated room within a temple complex or palace, sometimes connected to judicial buildings. Unlike the crude dungeons of later civilizations, these were often elegant spaces with painted walls and proper furnishings. Death might be inevitable, but it would be administered with appropriate decorum. Several archaeological sites contain rooms that scholars believe served this purpose, identifiable by their isolation, specialized ventilation systems, and sometimes drainage features designed to handle bodily fluids. Those condemned to the poison chamber were typically high-ranking individuals, disgraced nobles, priests who had violated sacred trusts, royal family members implicated in conspiracy, or foreign dignitaries whose elimination needed to appear natural. This wasn't a punishment for the pickpocket or the brawler. It was reserved for sophisticated crimes and complicated political situations where public execution might cause unrest or embarrassment. The administration of poison was itself ritualized. Specialized priests called carriers of the cup underwent extensive training, learning not just which substances to use, but how to prepare them for maximum efficacy and specific effects. These weren't mere executioners, but specialists who could tailor death to the crime, quick or slow, painful or peaceful, depending on what divine justice demanded. Egyptian poisons came from various sources. Plant-derived toxins were most common, with extracts from black henbane, mandrake, and certain species of acacia featuring prominently in historical records. Mineral poisons, particularly compounds containing arsenic and lead, were also utilized. Perhaps most sophisticated were animal venoms, carefully collected from scorpions, snakes, and certain Nile fish, then preserved and administered in controlled doses. One particularly detailed account comes from the reign of Ramesses III, describing the punishment of several harem women implicated in a plot against the pharaoh. According to the judicial papyrus, while the common conspirators faced public execution, the high-born women were given to themselves, a euphemism for poison that allowed them to die without public shame while still facing divine justice. The poison might be delivered in various ways. Most commonly, it was administered in wine, the alcohol masking bitter tastes and accelerating the poison's effects. For particularly honored condemned, the beautiful death involved lotus-infused wine containing a mixture of opiates and fast-acting plant toxins, producing a euphoric state before painless death. For those judged more harshly, the mixture might include irritants that caused internal bleeding or painful muscle contractions, the outward appearance of dignity masking an agonizing internal experience. What made this punishment uniquely Egyptian was its religious dimension. The poison wasn't just a chemical agent, but a divine instrument. Before administration, the substances would be ritually consecrated, often dedicated to Sekhmet, the goddess of both healing and destruction, or to Meretseger, she who loves silence, an appropriate deity for a quiet death. The condemned weren't simply being executed, they were being delivered to specific gods for judgment. The psychological aspects were calculated as well. Those sentenced to the poison chamber typically received advance notice, sometimes days or weeks before the actual administration. This period of anticipation was considered part of the punishment, time to contemplate one's crimes, put affairs in order, and prepare spiritually for judgment. Some historical accounts suggest the condemned might be required to write confessions or apologies during this period, documents that would be preserved in temple archives or sometimes read publicly after death. For a culture obsessed with proper preparation for the afterlife, death by poison presented unique theological questions. Would a body internally damaged by toxins be viable for the journey to the field of reeds? Most Egyptian religious texts suggest that poison was considered less spiritually problematic than dismemberment or burning, as the body remained outwardly intact. Some evidence indicates that poison victims still received proper mummification, though with specialized procedures to address their unusual cause of death. The poison chamber gained particular prominence during the late period and Ptolemaic era, when political intrigue reached new heights and the need for discreet elimination of rivals increased. Greek accounts describe the Egyptian art of subtle death, with a mixture of horror and admiration, noting the skill with which court poisoners could mimic natural illness or produce death at a precisely appointed hour. One remarkable case from the Ptolemaic period describes a high priest accused of temple treasury theft. Rather than face public humiliation, he requested the poison cup as a matter of honor. According to the account, he was granted a special formulation that would take effect during his evening prayers, allowing him to die while in communion with his gods. This represented a sort of compromise, punishment carried out but with sufficient dignity to preserve the temple's reputation. The technical sophistication shouldn't be underestimated. Egyptian poisoners understood concepts like dosage, body weight, and the interaction of different toxic compounds centuries before formal pharmacology existed. They knew which poisons left detectable traces and which disappeared from the body. They recognized that certain toxins affected specific organs or systems, allowing them to target particular bodily functions. This wasn't crude poisoning. It was precision toxicology applied as judicial procedure. Archaeological evidence provides some confirmation of these practices. Residue analysis of certain vessels found in suspected poison chambers has revealed traces of compounds like atropine and hyoscyamine, powerful plant alkaloids capable of causing death. Some mummies show evidence of poisonous substances in their preserved tissue, though determining whether these represent judicial punishment, assassination, or accidental poisoning remains challenging. For the victim, the experience varied dramatically depending on the specific poison administered. Some faced a relatively gentle decline, weakness, sleepiness, then unconsciousness, sliding into death. Others endured more dramatic symptoms, convulsions, paralysis, respiratory distress, or excruciating pain. The carriers of the cup maintained extensive knowledge of these effects, allowing them to match the punishment to the crime's severity. The existence of antidotes added another layer of complexity. Egyptian medical texts describe treatments for various poisons, suggesting that in some cases, survival might have been theoretically possible. Some scholars speculate that certain poison chamber sentences included the slim possibility of survival if the condemned's constitution proved exceptionally resilient, another form of divine judgment where the body's response determined ultimate guilt or innocence. Foreign dignitaries visiting Egypt often expressed particular fear of the poison chamber. Unlike more obvious execution methods, poisoning could happen anywhere, anytime, with plausible deniability. Several ancient accounts describe diplomatic visitors bringing their own food tasters or refusing Egyptian wine out of fear that their hosts might have decided they had overstayed their welcome. By the Roman period, the formal poison chamber had evolved into something more systematized but less religious. Roman administrators maintained the practice but stripped away much of its theological significance, treating it as merely an efficient method of execution rather than a divine transitional process. So the next time you hesitate before trying some exotic dish or double-check a medication dose, remember that your caution has ancient roots. In Egypt, a seemingly innocent cup of wine might contain not just the fruit of the vineyard, but the precisely calculated end of your earthly journey, administered not with hatred, but with professional detachment by specialists who saw themselves not as killers, but as agents of divine chemistry. But while poison offered a private end, other Egyptian punishments emphasized public shame and slow suffering under the kingdom's most omnipresent force, the sun itself. For some criminals, death would come not through animal attack or toxic ingestion, but through the slow, merciless embrace of Egypt's burning sands, turning the very desert that surrounded and defined their civilization into an instrument of calculated punishment. From the controlled environment of the poison chamber, we venture now into the vast, merciless expanse that both protected and threatened Egyptian civilization, the desert itself. If poison represented Egypt's mastery of nature's chemistry, sand burial demonstrated their ability to weaponize the very landscape that surrounded them, turning the omnipresent desert into an instrument of excruciatingly slow justice. Egypt was a narrow strip of green fertility surrounded by endless waves of sand. This geographical reality shaped everything from their agriculture to their theology and inevitably their approach to punishment. Why build elaborate execution chambers when the desert itself offered a perfect stage for prolonged suffering under the unforgiving eye of Ra, the sun god himself? This punishment was elegantly simple in concept, yet devastatingly complex in experience. The condemned, typically those guilty of crimes against the community, chronic thieves, oath breakers, or those who had violated desert taboos, would be taken beyond the fertile lands to a designated area of sand. There, they would be buried up to their neck, their body immobilized beneath the weight of countless grains, while their head remained exposed to the elements. What followed was not a quick execution, but a drawn-out process of suffering that could last days, combining physical torment with profound psychological horror. The desert sun would beat down relentlessly during daylight hours, causing dehydration, sunburn, and eventually blistering. At night, the dramatic temperature drop of desert regions would bring shivering cold. All the while, the victim remained conscious, unable to move, forced to experience every moment of their body's gradual deterioration. But the Egyptians, ever attentive to symbolic detail, often added a particularly gruesome enhancement to this already terrible fate. Historical records and tomb paintings indicate that honey, milk, or other sweet substances would frequently be applied to the exposed head and face of the condemned. This wasn't an act of mercy to ease suffering, but rather the opposite. An invitation to desert insects, particularly flies and ants, to feast upon the immobilized victim while they lived. The connection to Set, god of chaos and the desert, was explicit in this punishment. Set represented everything outside the ordered world of civilization, the unpredictable, dangerous forces that threatened Ma'at. By condemning someone to die in Set's domain, Egyptians were symbolically casting them out from the protection of the ordered world, delivering them to the god of chaos for judgment. Unlike many Egyptian punishments that were administered by specialists with religious training, sand burial often involved community participation. Villagers or even the victim's former neighbors might be required to assist in the digging and burial process, reinforcing the message that the criminal had violated not just abstract laws, but the community itself. This participatory aspect created a powerful social deterrent. Those who helped bury a criminal today would surely think twice before committing similar offenses themselves. Several papyri from the New Kingdom period contain administrative records of this punishment. One particularly detailed account from the reign of Thutmose III describes the punishment of a grain thief who had repeatedly stolen from community storehouses during a period of scarcity. The document clinically notes the location selected for his punishment, where the red sand meets the black land, a symbolically charged boundary between fertile Egypt and the chaotic desert. It also records the provision of a guard to prevent mercy killings by the condemned's family, ensuring the punishment would run its full course. The physical arrangement itself had theological significance. With the body below ground and only the head remaining above, the victim existed in a liminal state between the upper world of the living and the underworld of the dead, neither fully alive nor properly deceased. This in-between status created spiritual complications that would follow the victim into the afterlife. Without proper death rites or body preparation, their journey to the field of reeds would be compromised, if not impossible. For a culture that invested enormous resources in ensuring proper transition to the afterlife, this spiritual disruption represented punishment extending beyond physical death. The body, partially consumed by insects and animals, would be ritually incomplete. The soul, departing from a body neither properly buried nor appropriately prepared, would face confusion and potential rejection at the Hall of Two Truths, where Anubis weighed the heart against the feather of Mahat. Survival, while theoretically possible, was vanishingly rare. Historical records mention only a handful of cases where victims were retrieved alive, usually when the punishment was intentionally limited to a specific time period rather than continuing until death. One account from the late period describes a temple robber sentenced to 3 days in the embrace of Set, a survivable but still devastating experience that left the criminal permanently disfigured by sun exposure and insect damage. Foreign observers recorded their horror at witnessing this punishment. A Hittite diplomatic communication describes seeing criminals planted like human crops in the Red Land, their faces turned to the sky, their screams carrying across the dunes. The writer notes with evident disgust how Egyptian officials spoke of this practice, not with shame, but with pride in its justice and efficiency. The psychological dimension was carefully calculated. Victims could see rescue, the green lands of the Nile visible in the distance, perhaps even people going about their daily lives, but could not reach it. They experienced the slow deterioration of their own bodies while fully conscious. Thirst, typically the first serious challenge, would become overwhelming within hours, yet death might not come for days. The knowledge that desert animals, jackals, vultures, and other scavengers would eventually arrive added another layer of anticipatory terror. Archaeological evidence for this punishment is challenging to identify conclusively, as it leaves few distinctive marks on remains. However, some mummies and skeletal remains show patterns of insect damage and sun exposure, consistent with sand burial accounts. One particularly well-preserved example from the Third Intermediate period shows a skull with extensive ant damage concentrated around the facial features, suggesting the individual may have suffered this fate. The location chosen for sand burial often had additional significance. Some were conducted at specific desert boundaries, believed to be inhabited by dangerous spirits, or near wadis, where flash floods might eventually wash away the remains, adding another element of afterlife disruption. Others took place near desert crossroads, allowing maximum visibility to travelers who would carry tales of the punishment to other communities. During the Ptolemaic period, Greek administrators modified but maintained this practice, sometimes adding their own cultural elements. Greek accounts describe a version where philosophical texts were read to the condemned during their suffering, an oddly intellectual addition to a fundamentally physical punishment. This hybrid approach reflects the cultural blending characteristic of later Egyptian history, where traditional punishments were maintained but reinterpreted through foreign lenses. The desert itself was considered an active participant in this punishment, not merely a setting. The Egyptians personified the desert as an extension of Set's power, a living, hostile force that consumed the unworthy. Prayers and incantations would sometimes be recited not to ease the condemned suffering, but to encourage the desert to claim them more thoroughly, ensuring both physical and spiritual obliteration. One particularly detailed tomb painting from the reign of Amenhotep II shows a line of criminals at different stages of sand burial punishment. The artist has meticulously depicted the progressive deterioration, from initial burial with the victim alert and distressed, to later stages showing sunburn and insect activity, to final panels where only jackals remain, dragging away partially exposed remains. The sequential presentation suggests this was understood as a process rather than a single moment of execution. The practical logistics required careful planning. Guards were often posted, not to prevent escape, which was physically impossible, but to ensure the punishment proceeded without interference from family members or sympathetic onlookers. Records indicate these guards worked in shifts, as even they could not endure the desert conditions continuously. Some accounts mention priests periodically visiting to perform anti-rituals, inversions of normal religious practices designed to compound the spiritual damage being inflicted. So the next time you find yourself complaining about getting sand in your shoes at the beach or brushing it off your towel after a day in the sun, consider that in ancient Egypt, those same tiny grains served as instruments of one of history's most psychologically sophisticated punishments. That irritating substance we vacuum from our car floors once held people immobile, while the sun, insects, and time worked together to deliver divine justice in excruciatingly slow motion. But while sand burial represented a return to natural elements, some Egyptian punishments employed sophisticated, human-made technologies. From the primal desert, we turn now to something uniquely Egyptian, a punishment that combined their shipbuilding skill, religious symbolism, and theatrical sense into a floating chamber of horror. For certain criminals, particularly those whose crimes crossed boundaries between worlds, punishment would come not in the scorching sand, but upon the waters, sealed inside a vessel designed not for transportation, but for carefully orchestrated suffering. Now, as our Nile journey continues through the shadowy waters of Egyptian justice, let's drift towards something uniquely disturbing. A punishment that combined Egypt's reverence for boats with their flair for symbolic torment. The boat of death, or as some scrolls called it, the floating tomb, was punishment as performance art, a mobile execution that carried both body and soul into oblivion. Imagine this. You've been convicted of a particularly heinous crime, perhaps patricide, desecrating a tomb, or worst of all, killing a sacred animal. The gods are angry, the pharaoh is furious, and an ordinary execution simply won't satisfy the cosmic balance that's been disturbed. You're brought to the banks of the Nile, where two identical boats await. Not the grand solar barks that carried pharaohs, but smaller, purpose-built vessels, flat-bottomed with high sides, essentially floating coffins without lids. The boats weren't works of maritime beauty. They were instruments of justice, constructed specifically for this rare but theatrical punishment. Egyptian shipwrights, who normally crafted vessels with reverent care for both function and journey into the afterlife, built these death boats with a different purpose. The wood was often of lesser quality, unadorned with the usual protective symbols. After all, these boats weren't meant to last. They were temporary vessels for permanent endings. What made this punishment so uniquely Egyptian wasn't just the boats themselves, but what happened between them. The condemned wasn't simply placed in a boat and set adrift. That would be too merciful, too simple for a civilization that saw deep meaning in every aspect of death. Instead, the execution began with ritual purification, a final washing that wasn't for cleansing the soul, but marking it for judgment. Priests would recite invocations, not to protect the condemned, but to ensure the gods would recognize this death as justice rather than murder. Because in Egypt, how you died mattered as much as how you lived. Then came the truly nightmarish part. The prisoner was coated with milk and honey, sweet substances that in the desert heat would quickly become something far less pleasant. This wasn't random cruelty. The milk and honey served a specific purpose in this elaborate torment. They would attract insects, both biting and stinging varieties, creating the first layer of suffering. But insects were just the beginning. The honey-coated condemned was then placed in the first boat, and here's where Egyptian ingenuity for torture truly shined. They didn't leave him alone. Oh no, they added companions. Into this first boat went a collection of animals, often a mix carefully chosen for maximum discomfort. Picture it: a dog to represent the god Anubis, watching and judging; a snake to symbolize Apophis, the enemy of order; a scorpion for Serket, goddess of healing turned agent of vengeance; and perhaps a monkey to add chaos to the mix. Some accounts even mention cats, sacred to Bastet, now witnesses to divine punishment. These weren't just random creatures. Each animal represented a specific deity or cosmic force in Egyptian religion. Their presence turned the boat into a floating judgment hall, a mobile extension of the afterlife weighing of the heart. The condemned wasn't just dying, they were being judged by divine proxies in agonizing real time. Once the prisoner and animals were situated in the first boat, the second identical vessel was placed over top, creating a sealed chamber with openings only for the head and hands. These openings weren't mercy, they were simply to prolong the torment. The condemned needed to breathe, needed to remain conscious to experience the full weight of their punishment. The twin boats were then sealed with pitch or wax, creating a floating prison from which there was no escape. And here's the genius of ancient Egyptian cruelty. They didn't just execute you, they isolated you within a microcosm of chaos, forcing you to experience a perversion of the journey every Egyptian soul hoped to make after death. With ceremonial words, and perhaps a final pronouncement of crimes, the floating tomb was pushed into the current of the Nile. Not just any section of the river, but often at points where the current moved steadily toward the Mediterranean. The boat wouldn't simply circle in eddies near the shore. It would travel, carrying its grim cargo downstream, a visible warning to all who saw it pass. Imagine being a farmer, working your field along the Nile, when this strange jewel-hulled boat drifts by, the head of the condemned visible, their cries mingling with the sounds of animals inside. It wasn't just a punishment, it was a theatrical public service announcement about the consequences of defying Ma'at, the cosmic order. What happened inside that sealed chamber was left to horrific imagination, but historical accounts give us clues. The confined space, the heat, the hungry animals, the stinging insects attracted by honey, the gradual weakening from thirst and hunger. This wasn't swift justice, it was calculated, prolonged suffering that could last days. Death came in stages, first from the attacks of the confined animals, then from dehydration, exposure, or drowning if the sealed boats eventually took on water. Some accounts suggest that particularly unlucky souls survived for up to a week in this floating hell, their suffering visible to settlements along the river as they drifted past. One papyrus from the reign of Ramesses II mentions a high priest who stole gold from temple offerings to pay gambling debts. His punishment? The boat of death, set adrift near Thebes, his journey ending somewhere near the delta days later. The text describes how settlements along the river heard his cries diminish day by day, until silence finally indicated justice had been served. We know of this punishment not just from Egyptian sources, but from the horrified accounts of Greek historians who witnessed it during later periods. Diodorus Siculus wrote with particular revulsion about this most terrible of all deaths, noting how it combined physical torment with spiritual devastation. For to die this way meant no proper burial, no mummification, no chance at the afterlife. And that was perhaps the most terrible aspect of the boat punishment. It wasn't just about physical suffering, it was about eternal consequences. To die without proper funeral rites, to have your body consumed by animals rather than preserved, this was to risk oblivion beyond death, the true fear of every ancient Egyptian. The symbolism went deeper still. The boat itself perverted one of Egypt's most sacred images, the solar bark that carried Ra through the night to be reborn each morning. Every Egyptian hoped their soul would join Ra on this eternal journey. But the death boat offered the opposite. Not rebirth, but erasure. Not journey, but entrapment. Not ascension, but a one-way trip to nothingness. The use of two boats also carried meaning. In Egyptian mythology, the god Osiris was tricked into a coffin by his brother Set, sealed inside and cast into the Nile. The boat punishment mirrored this divine tragedy, but without the resurrection that Osiris experienced. It was death without hope of return. Archaeological evidence for this punishment is sparse but compelling. Near the ancient site of Per-Rameses in the Delta region, archaeologists uncovered what appears to be a specialized boat-building area with smaller, crudely constructed hull remnants that don't match typical Egyptian watercraft. Clay seals found nearby bear inscriptions that translate roughly to vessel of judgment or boat of the condemned. While the floating tomb punishment wasn't as common as impalement or other methods of execution, it held a special place of dread in Egyptian consciousness. It appeared in warnings to officials, in temple inscriptions listing consequences for sacrilege, and in cautionary tales told to the young. The boat of death reminds us that Egyptian punishment wasn't just about ending a criminal's life. It was about making that ending meaningful, symbolic, and instructive. Every aspect carried weight, from the animals chosen to the river's current, from the honey coating to the final drifting journey. So next time you're enjoying a pleasant boat ride, perhaps on a lake or down a peaceful river, be thankful you're not experiencing the ancient Egyptian version of nautical justice. Your vessel is for leisure, not torment. Your companions are friends, not symbolic agents of divine retribution. And your journey has a return ticket, something the passengers of Egypt's death boats never received. As the floating tomb drifts from our view, carried away by the ancient currents of the Nile, let's turn our attention to another uniquely Egyptian method of dispensing justice, one that turned death itself into a sacred art form, wielded by the chosen few with blades that served both state and cosmos. As our boat drifts away from the floating tomb, let's turn our attention to something that gleams in the Egyptian sun: the ceremonial blades that brought swift justice to those deemed unworthy of more elaborate endings. While floating coffins and sand burial might have captured more horrified fascination, there's something distinctly chilling about the calculated precision of Egypt's execution blades. The ancient Egyptians, ever the artisans, didn't simply cut off heads. They elevated execution to ceremonial art, with specialized weapons designed specifically for dispatching the condemned. Chief among these was the hopesh, that distinctive curved sword that resembles a question mark made of bronze or iron, as if the weapon itself were questioning the life it was about to end. But the standard military khopesh wasn't what awaited prisoners facing the executioner's blade. No, for special executions, particularly those of high-ranking individuals or sacred offenders, Egypt developed specialized execution blades. These weren't merely tools, they were sacred instruments, often dedicated to specific gods and used only for the ritual separation of body and ka. Imagine being led to the execution ground at dawn, the favored time for such proceedings. Before you isn't some grizzled executioner with a nicked, well-used blade. Instead stands a high priest or royal official holding a gleaming khopesh that might have never drawn blood before yours. The blade itself would be a masterwork of metallurgy, often inlaid with gold, electrum, or precious stones. The handle might bear the visage of Sekhmet, the lioness goddess of divine retribution, or perhaps Amit, the soul-devouring monster of the underworld. These ceremonial execution blades were kept in temple sanctuaries, brought out only when needed and purified before and after each use. They weren't mere implements of death. They were conduits of divine judgment, physical manifestations of Ma'at's balance being restored through the separation of a criminal's head from their shoulders. Archaeological evidence for these specialized blades comes primarily from tomb paintings and temple reliefs rather than the weapons themselves. A notable depiction at Medinet Habu shows what appears to be a ceremonial execution of foreign prisoners, the officiating priest holding a blade distinctly different from military weapons, longer, more ornate, with hieroglyphs etched along its length. The few actual execution blades recovered by archaeologists tell a fascinating story. One specimen found near Abydos, dating to the 19th dynasty, bears an inscription that roughly translates to "Severance of the Unworthy." Its blade was intentionally weighted toward the tip, designed not for combat, but for the clean delivery of a single, fatal stroke. Analysis of its edge showed it had been honed to extraordinary sharpness, then ritually dulled and resharpened with ceremonial incantations before each use. Who wielded these instruments of sacred death? Contrary to what you might expect, it wasn't brawny, faceless executioners. Egypt's ceremonial blades were most often entrusted to priests of specific deities, particularly those associated with justice or divine punishment. The bearers of the sacred blade formed their own minor priestly order, trained not just in the physical act of execution, but in the proper rituals surrounding it. For particularly important executions, say, a high priest who betrayed temple secrets, or a royal official who plotted against Pharaoh, the honor might fall to someone even more distinguished. There are records suggesting that for certain treasonous nobles, the execution blade was wielded by the pharaoh's champion, his symbolic representative, or in extraordinary cases, by a prince of the royal blood. The message was clear. This death came not from a common executioner, but from divine authority itself. Before an execution could take place, both blade and condemned underwent ritual preparation. The sword would be purified through fire and sacred oils, then presented at the temple altar of the appropriate deity, often Sekhmet for traitors, Thoth for those who had falsified records, or Maat herself for those who had severely disrupted cosmic order. The condemned, meanwhile, was prepared through a perverse mirror of mummification rituals. Rather than preserving the body for eternity, these preparatory rites were designed to mark the person for divine judgment. Their head might be shaved, their body washed with natron solution, and specific spells recited, not to ensure safe passage to the afterlife, but to highlight their transgressions for the gods' attention. On the execution ground, typically located at a symbolically significant site, perhaps the edge of the desert representing the boundary between order and chaos, or near a temple to emphasize divine justice, final rituals were performed. The crimes would be recited once more, the gods invoked as witnesses, and then, with a precision that would impress even the most skilled surgeon, the blade would fall. But here's where Egyptian execution diverged further from mere punishment. The head, once separated, wasn't always displayed as a warning like in other ancient cultures. Instead, it might receive specialized treatment depending on the crime. For traitors, the head might be placed facing away from the blessed west, ensuring their spirit would wander lost rather than reach the field of reeds. For temple robbers, the head might be burned to ash, symbolizing complete erasure from the Book of Life. A papyrus from the reign of Ramesses III describes the execution of a treasury official who had stolen gold intended for temple offerings. After the ceremonial blade fell, his head was placed in a special basket, carried to the temple he had robbed, and presented before the deity's statue as restoration of Ma'at. The text notes that his body was left unburied at the desert's edge, a double death of both body and hope for an afterlife. The Egyptian concern with proper burial and preservation makes their execution practices particularly fascinating. For a culture so obsessed with preparing for the afterlife, the denial of proper death rites was a punishment that extended beyond the physical realm. To die under the ceremonial blade wasn't just to lose your life. It was to risk eternal oblivion. Yet not all blade executions ended in spiritual destruction. For some offenders, particularly those who had admitted guilt and shown proper remorse, the ceremonial blade offered a perversely merciful option. Their heads, once separated, might receive basic funeral rites, allowing at least the possibility of an afterlife, albeit a diminished one. This selective mercy reinforced the Egyptian belief that justice wasn't about vengeance, but about restoring cosmic balance. One of the most remarkable aspects of Egypt's execution blades was their dual nature, as both punishment and religious artifact. When not in use, these weapons were often displayed in temple sanctuaries, their presence a constant reminder of divine justice. Priests would maintain them with the same care given to statues of the gods, regularly anointing them with oils and reciting prayers over their gleaming surfaces. In later periods, particularly under Ptolemaic rule, the ceremonial aspects of blade execution became even more elaborate. Greek historians describe executions that had evolved into theatrical religious performances, with multiple priests, music, incense, and complex rituals that could last hours before the blade finally fell. What had once been punishment had become sacred performance. Archaeological evidence suggests that execution grounds themselves became semi-permanent religious sites. At a New Kingdom site near Thebes, archaeologists uncovered what appears to be a dedicated execution area with a stone block positioned to catch the severed head, drainage channels for blood, and small offering niches where incense or small statues would have stood. The physical layout suggests these weren't hasty executions, but carefully choreographed religious ceremonies. So next time you see those elegant curved khopesh swords in museum displays, looking beautiful and almost artistic with their graceful curves and gilded handles, remember they weren't just weapons of war. Some were instruments of divine justice, wielded not in battle's chaos, but in death's careful ceremony. That beautiful artifact behind glass once separated souls from bodies, lives from futures, criminals from society. The ceremonial blades of Egypt remind us that even in death, perhaps especially in death, the ancient Egyptians found meaning, ritual, and cosmic significance. They didn't just kill, they severed with purpose, executed with precision, and transformed the end of a human life into a restoration of divine order. As the blade returns to its sacred resting place, gleaming with oil and freshly cleansed of blood, we turn our attention to a punishment that offered no swift release, no ceremonial ending, only years of suffering in darkness, far from the sun god's blessed light. Let us descend now into the mines, where Egypt's condemned faced not a moment of death, but a lifetime of it. As the executioner's blade returns to its sacred resting place, we turn to a punishment that offered no swift mercy, no ceremonial ending, just slow, grinding torment that could stretch across years until the body finally surrendered. Welcome to Egypt's notorious mines, where punishment wasn't measured in moments of pain, but in endless days of suffering beneath the scorching desert. Unlike the theatrical punishments we've explored thus far, forced labor in the mines lacked the dramatic flair of public execution. There were no crowds to witness, no priests performing rituals, no symbolic animals or ceremonial boats. Yet what this punishment lacked in spectacle, it made up for in sheer, relentless brutality. The mines were where Egypt sent those it wanted to forget, but only after extracting every last drop of labor from their condemned bodies. The most infamous of these punishment mines were located in Egypt's eastern desert and in Sinai, harsh landscapes where gold, copper, and turquoise were torn from unyielding earth. Places with names that became synonymous with suffering: Serabit, El Khadim, Wadi Magara, and perhaps most notorious of all, Gebel El Zait, the mountain of oil, where even the air seemed to shimmer with heat and misery. Imagine being marched across burning desert sands, already weakened from imprisonment, your crimes announced to any settlements you passed. Your head would be shaved, your body marked with ochre paint or distinctive scars to identify you as a mine prisoner. Some were even branded on the forehead with the name of the mine that would become their living tomb. The journey itself claimed many lives, a prelude to the hardship awaiting survivors. Upon arrival, you'd find not cells or barracks, but crude camps carved into rock faces or huddled beneath overhangs. Minimal shelter from a sun that baked the land by day and winds that cut like knives at night. The beds were depressions in the ground, sometimes lined with rough palm fiber mats if you were fortunate. Water came in strictly rationed portions, never quite enough to satisfy desert thirst. Food was basic sustenance, enough to keep you working, not enough to give you strength for rebellion. Archaeological excavations at these ancient mining sites tell a grim story. At Serabit el-Qadim, researchers found skeletal remains showing distinctive patterns of wear on the vertebrae and shoulder joints, evidence of bodies broken by years of hunching in narrow tunnels and hammering at rock faces. Analysis of bones revealed high levels of copper and other metals absorbed into the very marrow, slow poisoning that accumulated with each passing month. But perhaps most telling were the mass graves, shallow trenches where bodies were stacked with minimal ceremony, sometimes dozens deep. No mummification, no funeral goods, no prayers for the afterlife, just anonymous corpses of those who had finally escaped their punishment through death's mercy. Who was sent to the mines? While common criminals might face impalement or beheading, the mines were reserved for specific categories of offenders: rebels and insurrectionists who challenged pharaonic authority but weren't important enough to warrant ceremonial execution, temple thieves who'd stolen from the gods but weren't deemed worthy of divine punishments, tax evaders who'd withheld what was owed to the state, and during times of war, captured enemy soldiers who were too valuable as labor to simply execute. One papyrus from the reign of Thutmose III describes a court scribe who had falsified grain records, diverting temple offerings to his own stores. His punishment? To be sent to the Copper Mountains of Sinai, there to labor until Osiris calls him to judgment. A lifetime sentence in a few simple words. The work itself was a calculated torment. Imagine being lowered into narrow shafts, barely wide enough for your shoulders, with only a guttering oil lamp for light, if you were given light at all. Some prisoners worked in complete darkness, feeling their way along seams of ore. The air in these depths was thick with dust that coated lungs and gradually suffocated from within. Temperatures could reach unbearable levels, the rock faces so hot they would burn bare skin upon contact. Tools were primitive but effective: stone hammers, copper chisels, wooden wedges. Hour after hour, day after day, prisoners would chip away at the rock face, filling baskets that were hauled to the surface. Quotas were set, impossible targets that ensured beatings regardless of effort. Each prisoner knew the brutal equation: work until you collapse, then work more, or face the overseer's lash. These overseers, often selected from hardened criminals who'd earned slight privilege through brutality or information, wielded almost unlimited power within the mines. A hieroglyphic inscription at Wadi el-Hudi describes them as jackals who drink suffering like water. Their methods of maintaining discipline were ingenious in their cruelty, from restricting water rations to forcing exhausted prisoners to stand all night if daily quotas weren't met. Perhaps most psychologically devastating was the isolation. Unlike other forms of punishment that took place near population centers, the mines existed in remote wasteland, cut off from all normal human contact. No family visits, no news from home, no knowledge of whether loved ones still lived or had forgotten the condemned entirely. The only communications were orders barked by guards, the groans of fellow prisoners, and the eternal sound of metal striking stone. How long did mine prisoners survive? Records suggest the average was between 2 and 3 years, though this varied greatly depending on the prisoner's prior health, the specific mine conditions, and whether they secured any favored position. A few exceptional individuals lasted a decade or more, their bodies adapting to conditions that would kill most within months. These long-term survivors became living legends among new arrivals, their scarred bodies and hollow eyes serving as walking prophecies of what awaited. A remarkable ostracon, inscribed pottery shard, found near Serabit el-Qadim, contains what appears to be a prisoner's tally marks: 1,823 vertical scratches grouped in sets of 10. Nearly 5 years of counting days in darkness before the record ends abruptly. We can only guess what ended the count: death, transfer, or perhaps the rare miracle of pardon. What's particularly striking about Egypt's mining punishment was its economic purpose. This wasn't just about punishing criminals. It was about extracting value from them. Gold, copper, and turquoise were the lifeblood of Egyptian wealth and power. The temple decorations, the royal jewelry, the traded goods that built diplomatic relationships, much of it came from mines where the condemned labored and died. A wall painting from the tomb of Rekhmir, vizier under Thutmose III, shows mine prisoners processing turquoise, their bodies thin and bent, overseers standing with raised sticks. The accompanying hieroglyphs speak not of punishment, but of production, bringing forth beauty from the mountain for the Lord of the two lands. Even in their suffering, prisoners served the glory of Egypt. The mines reveal the practical side of Egyptian justice, a system that didn't waste potential resources, even human ones. While religious symbolism infused most punishments, mine labor represented cold pragmatism. The state had mouths to feed, temples to build, gods to appease. The condemned would contribute, willing or not. Some prisoners found small mercies even in this bleakest of punishments. Those with specialized knowledge, metalworkers, stonecutters, or scribes, might secure slightly better conditions, assigned to processing workshops rather than the suffocating depths. Others formed the tight bonds that shared suffering creates, developing silent languages of taps and signals to communicate beyond the overseer's hearing. There were even rare cases of redemption. A stele from the late New Kingdom period mentions a prisoner who discovered an exceptionally rich gold vein and was granted partial freedom as reward. Another text speaks of skilled prisoners earning the right to send messages home after years of compliant labor. Small comforts in an existence defined by discomfort. Escape was nearly impossible. The mines were naturally isolated, surrounded by desert that offered no water, no shelter, and no hope of survival, even if one could slip past the guards. Those who attempted it were brought back, if desert predators didn't find them first, and made examples of. One account describes escaped prisoners bound to rocks at the mine entrance, left to die of exposure while serving as grim warnings to others. For most, the only escape came through death, which brings us to perhaps the most profound horror of mine punishment, its impact on the Egyptian concept of afterlife. Remember, proper burial was essential for the journey to the field of reeds. Yet mine prisoners received no mummification, no funeral goods, often not even intact burial. Their bodies were discarded, their names forgotten, their spirits left to wander. Some papyri suggest this was intentional. Part of the punishment was spiritual death, the complete erasure from both worldly memory and eternal record. Other texts hint at small rituals performed by fellow prisoners, whispered prayers to Osiris, asking him to recognize souls that had suffered enough in life to deserve peace in death. Archaeological evidence from later periods shows small amulets clutched in the hands of mine burial remains. Tiny, crude scarabs or ankh symbols fashioned from stone scraps during precious moments of rest. These poignant objects suggest that even in their despair, prisoners clung to hope of an afterlife, crafting makeshift spiritual insurance with the few materials available to them. So next time you admire the gleaming gold of an Egyptian museum piece or the vibrant blue-green of ancient turquoise jewelry, spare a thought for the forgotten hands that likely extracted those materials. Behind every golden treasure and royal adornment lies the invisible suffering of those condemned to the living death of the mines, their punishment fueling the very splendor that would outlast them by millennia. As we emerge blinking from the darkness of the mines, let us turn our attention to a punishment that was less physically brutal, but perhaps even more psychologically devastating. A trial where the judges weren't human at all, but the silent, implacable faces of the gods themselves. As we emerge from the suffocating darkness of the mines, squinting against the light we'd almost forgotten, let's turn to a punishment that left no physical scars, but could break the spirit more thoroughly than any lash. In ancient Egypt, where the line between the mortal and divine realms was gossamer thin, perhaps no judgment carried more weight than that delivered not by human authorities, but by the gods themselves, or at least their earthly representations. Welcome to the divine trial, where your judge, jury, and potential executioner wasn't a vizier or even pharaoh, but the unblinking eyes of deity statues whose subtle movements, or lack thereof, could determine whether you lived or died, were pardoned or punished, blessed or cursed. Imagine being accused of a crime where evidence was scarce or contradictory. Perhaps you're a temple functionary suspected of stealing offerings, a witness whose testimony in a land dispute was questioned, or even a high official accused of corruption. In cases where human judgment seemed insufficient, where truth was elusive or the stakes particularly high, you might find yourself facing not a human tribunal, but the statue of a god. These weren't just any court proceedings. Divine trials took place in temple sanctuaries, spaces ordinarily forbidden to all but the highest priests. The accused would be brought in at dawn, purified with natron water, dressed in white linen, and made to kneel before a portable statue of a deity, most commonly Amun, the hidden one, who could see all secrets, or Thoth, master of wisdom and judgment. The psychological impact was immediate and intentional. Unlike human judges who could be bribed, reasoned with, or appealed to, the implacable face of a god offered no hint of mercy or inclination. The ritual setting, incense hanging heavy in the air, priests chanting in ancient tongue, the weight of sacred space pressing down, was designed to break through deception. Many confessed their crimes before the trial even began, overcome by the certainty that divine omniscience would reveal their guilt anyway. For those who maintained innocence, or whose cases genuinely required divine insight, the trial itself was an exercise in carefully managed theater that nonetheless produced results many believed truly reflected divine will. The question would be written on papyrus and read aloud to the deity. The statue, mounted on long carrying poles, resting on the shoulders of priests, would then be consulted for its answer. Here's where the fascinating intersection of religion, psychology, and perhaps a touch of ancient stage management came into play. The priests carrying the statue would ask yes or no questions, and the god would respond through movement. A forward tilt meaning yes, a backward tilt meaning no. Sometimes more complex responses could be obtained by having the statue move toward written options placed around the sanctuary. A papyrus from Deir el-Medina records a divine trial where a worker named Amenemope was accused of stealing a chisel from the royal tomb project. The account describes how Amun nodded forward greatly when asked if another worker was the true culprit, exonerating Amenemope and redirecting suspicion. Whether this movement came from genuine divine intervention, unconscious movements of the priest-bearers, or more deliberate manipulation remains one of ancient Egypt's more intriguing mysteries. Archaeological evidence for these trials comes not just from textual sources, but from the specialized bark statues themselves. These weren't the massive stone images that sat immobile in temple sanctums, but smaller, portable versions made of precious wood, often covered in gold leaf, with hollow sections that made them lighter for processions and consultations. Some had specialized mechanisms at their carrying poles, not necessarily for fraudulent manipulation, but perhaps to amplify the subtle movements of the bearers. The priests who carried these divine judges weren't random temple functionaries. They were specially selected, often from particular families with hereditary rights to touch the sacred barks. They underwent extensive training and purification, and were believed to be vessels through which the deity might express its will. Were they consciously deciding the outcomes, or were their small, unconscious movements genuinely reflecting their deep, spiritual connection to the divine? The Egyptians themselves would have seen no contradiction. To them, the gods worked through human instruments. Divine trials weren't used for petty matters. They were reserved for cases of special significance, religious offenses, matters affecting the state, disputes between high officials, or situations where conventional evidence had proven insufficient. The gravity of bringing a question before the gods ensured that these trials had tremendous psychological impact regardless of their mechanism. One of the most famous divine trials in Egyptian history occurred during the reign of Ramesses III, when conspirators in the Harem conspiracy plot to assassinate the king were brought before the deity Amun-Ra. According to surviving records, the god identified the guilty parties through its movements, and those individuals were then subjected to conventional punishments, including, for some, the nose and ear removal we discussed earlier. These divine consultations weren't just for criminal matters. Temple statues were also consulted on questions of succession, particularly in periods of dynastic uncertainty. The famous story of how Thutmose III was selected as pharaoh involves the god Amun's statue breaking from its processional route to stop directly before the young prince, essentially choosing him over other candidates. Whether orchestrated or spontaneous, this divine endorsement secured his claim to the throne. For the accused, the experience of divine trial went beyond mere legal procedure. It was a spiritual ordeal that could permanently alter their relationship with both society and the gods. Those found innocent by divine verdict weren't just legally cleared. They were spiritually validated, sometimes elevated in status as people specially recognized by deity. Conversely, those found guilty faced not just earthly punishment, but the knowledge that the gods themselves had rejected them. The psychological torture of waiting for the slight movement of a wooden statue to determine your fate cannot be overstated. Witnesses describe accused persons fainting, confessing to additional unknown crimes, or experiencing religious conversion during these trials. Some would promise elaborate offerings or lifetime service to the temple if found innocent, negotiations with the divine that reveal the desperate stakes involved. But what of those who questioned the validity of these divine judgments? Surviving texts suggest skepticism was not unknown, particularly in later periods when Greek influence brought more rationalistic thinking to Egypt. One fascinating text from the Ptolemaic period describes a case where the accused demanded a second opinion from another deity statue after being found guilty by the first. This request was, perhaps surprisingly, granted, though the second god concurred with the first, to the accused's dismay. The priests themselves likely understood the power dynamics at play. A remarkable papyrus containing instructions for junior priests warns them to be mindful of standing behind those who bear the god's image, for the breath of your sighs can cause movement that is not the god's will. This suggests awareness of the potential for unconscious influence, even while maintaining the fundamental belief in divine participation. For modern minds, it's easy to dismiss these trials as elaborate theater or religious manipulation, but this misses their profound significance in a culture where the boundary between natural and supernatural was permeable, where gods were living forces directly engaged in human affairs. The divine trial represents the Egyptian belief that justice was not merely a human construct, but a cosmic principle, ma'at, that required divine participation to be fully realized. The legacy of these divine trials echoed long after ancient Egypt itself faded. Elements of the practice survived in Greek oracles and early Christian saint consultations. The fundamental human desire to access divine judgment, to receive answers from beyond human limitation, persisted through changing religions and cultures. So next time you find yourself nervously awaiting a judge's verdict or a jury's decision, be thankful at least that your fate isn't being determined by the subtle tilt of a golden statue, interpreted by priests who might be channeling divine will, or might simply be responding to the draft from an open temple door. Modern justice systems, for all their flaws, at least give you the chance to see the human reasoning behind your judgment, rather than the inscrutable will of a deity who might condemn you for offenses you didn't even know you'd committed. As we leave the temple sanctuary, the god's statue returning to its sacred darkness until the next supplicant requires divine insight, let us turn to a punishment that sought truth through more direct and painful means, a method that valued confession over compassion and precision over mercy. The reed awaits, and with it, a trial of a very different kind. As the temple doors close behind us, the divine statues return to their sacred shadows. We turn our attention to a punishment that sought truth, not through divine revelation, but through exquisitely calculated pain. Where the gods might be consulted for judgment, Sometimes Egyptian justice required more immediate and visceral confessions. Enter the reed test, a method of interrogation and punishment that transformed the humble Nile reed into an instrument of precise torment. The reed, that ubiquitous plant that grew in abundance along the Nile's banks, used for everything from papyrus to boats, from mats to flutes, also found a darker purpose in Egypt's justice system. In the hands of specialized interrogators, these seemingly fragile plants became tools for extracting truth through methodical suffering. Unlike the crude torture methods of later civilizations, the reed test was a refined procedure, almost medical in its precision. It wasn't about maximizing pain, but about applying it with such careful calculation that even the strongest will would eventually yield to truth. The Egyptians, ever pragmatic, understood that extreme torture often produces false confessions. The reed test was designed to create enough discomfort to break resistance without pushing the subject beyond rationality. Picture yourself accused of a serious crime, perhaps temple theft or conspiracy against an official. Evidence exists, but isn't conclusive. Your denials seem plausible. This is where the reed test might be employed, not as punishment for proven guilt, but as a means to determine that guilt in the first place. You would be brought to a specialized chamber, often connected to a temple or administrative building. These rooms have been identified at several archaeological sites, most notably at Buhen and Memphis. Small, windowless spaces with distinctive drainage systems and stone slabs positioned at waist height. The drainage wasn't for water, but for the fluids that inevitably resulted from the procedure. The accused would be secured to this slab, arms and legs immobilized, but with the body accessible to the reed bearer, a specialized official trained in the art of pain without permanent damage. These weren't common jailers, but educated men, often with scribal training, who understood anatomy and psychology. Their title, surviving in hieroglyphic texts, translates roughly to "he who finds truth through the reed." The reeds themselves were carefully selected and prepared, not the thick stems used for construction, but younger, more flexible shoots, cut to specific lengths and sometimes treated with oils or briefly heated to increase their resilience. Some were left with their natural points. Others were trimmed to create different sensations. A skilled reed bearer might carry a dozen or more, each designed for particular applications. The test would begin with the formal reading of the accusation, followed by an opportunity for confession. Then, if denial persisted, the methodical application of the reeds would commence. Unlike flogging or beating, which delivers blunt trauma, the reeds were used with surgical precision on sensitive areas of the body, under fingernails, between toes, against eyelids, inside nostrils, and other vulnerable points. The Egyptians had mapped the human body's pain responses with remarkable accuracy. A medical papyrus from the Ramessid period contains what appears to be a guide for reed bearers, mapping 46 specific points of particular sensitivity. The document emphasizes the importance of avoiding permanent injury while maximizing discomfort, a perversely sophisticated understanding of pain management in reverse. What made the reed test particularly effective was its incremental nature. It began with mild discomfort and gradually intensified. The interrogator would ask questions, apply the reed, wait for response, then move to another area, building a symphony of pain across the body's most sensitive regions. There was no single moment of unbearable agony, just a slowly rising tide of discomfort that made resistance increasingly impossible. Water played a key role in these sessions. The subject would be given small sips between applications, not as mercy, but to ensure they remained conscious and coherent. Some texts mention special herbal preparations administered during longer sessions that prevented fainting without dulling pain, an early pharmacological approach to maintaining consciousness during interrogation. A remarkable ostracon found at Deir el-Medina records what appears to be a reed test confession. The text begins with formal denials of theft, then deteriorates into increasingly desperate admissions, the handwriting becoming shaky, whether from the scribe recording a faltering voice or from the subject attempting to write during the procedure remains unclear. The final lines include a detailed inventory of stolen items and accomplices, followed by a plea to Maat for forgiveness. The reed test's connection to Maat, goddess of truth and cosmic order, was fundamental. This wasn't seen as mere torture, but as a sacred procedure for revealing hidden truths that threatened cosmic balance. Interrogation chambers often contained small shrines to Maat, her feather symbol prominently displayed. Some even featured her scales painted on the wall opposite the subject, a constant reminder that their pain was insignificant compared to the weighing of their heart in the afterlife. Priests often participated in these sessions, not applying the reeds themselves, but observing, sometimes reciting invocations to Maat or Thoth between questions. Their presence transformed interrogation into ritual, pain into purification. The confession wasn't just information extracted, it was spiritual realignment, the restoration of truth to a situation corrupted by falsehood. While most civilizations separated torture and medical treatment, Egypt maintained a disturbing overlap. The same medical papyri that detailed treatments for illness also contained sections on proper reed test techniques. The same hands that healed might also administer pain in service to truth. This duality reflects Egypt's holistic view of physical and spiritual health, both requiring the removal of harmful elements, whether disease or deception. Not everyone subjected to the reed test was guilty, of course. False accusations happened in ancient Egypt as in any society. So what of those who maintained their innocence despite the reeds? Records suggest that substantial resistance to the procedure could itself be taken as evidence of truthfulness. One text describes a merchant who endured the full sequence of reed applications without confession. He was not only released, but compensated with a small grant of land for his proven honesty. The reed test wasn't applied equally across Egyptian society. For common laborers or slaves, basic beating or flogging remained the standard. The methodical reed procedure was reserved for those whose crimes required detailed information, conspirators whose accomplices needed identification, thieves whose hidden caches needed location, or officials whose corrupt networks needed mapping. It was pain with purpose, suffering in service to specific information. For the highest elites, even the reed test was considered too undignified. A New Kingdom text describes an alternative for noble subjects, the questioning under the eye of Horus, which substituted psychological pressure and sleep deprivation for physical pain. The accused would be placed in a small, brightly lit chamber, with the unblinking eye of Horus painted on every surface, then questioned continuously by rotating teams of priests for days until exhaustion broke their resistance. The psychological effects of the reed test extended far beyond the interrogation chamber. Those who had experienced it carried not just physical sensitivity, but a form of spiritual trauma. Many sought extensive purification rituals afterward, regardless of guilt or innocence, feeling fundamentally violated not just bodily, but spiritually. Some papyri describe specialized healing of the Ka ceremonies specifically for those who had undergone interrogation by reed. Archaeological evidence for the reed test includes more than just the chambers themselves. At several sites, particularly administrative centers, caches of preserved reeds have been found, bundles of different sizes and thicknesses, some with distinctive wear patterns consistent with repeated use against resistant surfaces. Analysis of these implements reveals sophisticated craftsmanship, with some showing evidence of having been soaked in solutions containing mild irritants to enhance their effect. The legacy of the reed test is a complex one. It represents both the sophistication of Egyptian understanding of human physiology and the calculated cruelty they were willing to employ in pursuit of Ma'at. It reflected their belief that truth was sacred enough to justify suffering in its revelation, that cosmic order sometimes required physical disorder to maintain. So the next time you feel the mild discomfort of a splinter beneath your skin or the irritation of a paper cut, consider how the ancient Egyptians transformed such minor sensations into an entire science of graduated pain. Those tiny reed fragments that you pluck out with tweezers and promptly forget were once carefully selected, deliberately applied, and systematically employed to extract the most guarded secrets from even the most resistant minds. As we step away from the reed-bearer's chamber, ears still ringing with imagined confessions torn from unwilling lips, let us turn to our final Egyptian punishment, one that might seem merciful in its lack of physical pain, yet represented perhaps the most complete destruction an Egyptian could face. For in a culture where belonging was everything, what could be worse than being cast out, sent away, erased from the community that gave life meaning? Let us walk now to the desert's edge, where exile awaited those who would never again call Egypt home. As we leave behind the reed-bearer's chamber, the confessions still echoing in our ears, we approach our final destination in this journey through Egypt's darkest punishments. We stand now at the boundary where lush black soil meets harsh yellow sand, where life meets death, where Egypt ends and nothingness begins. Here, at this liminal edge, we encounter a punishment that inflicted no physical pain, yet represented a fate many Egyptians considered worse than execution: exile to the desert, the living death. For a modern mind, exile might seem a merciful alternative to the reed, the blade, or the crocodile's jaws. After all, the banished person still lived, still breathed, still had a chance at some kind of future. But to understand the true horror of desert exile in ancient Egypt, we must first understand what it meant to be Egyptian, to belong to the ordered, irrigated, divine-blessed land of Kemet, the black land of fertile soil along the Nile. Egyptian identity wasn't just nationality as we understand it today. It was a cosmic position, a place in Ma'at's ordered universe. To be Egyptian was to exist within a complex web of relationships, with family, with community, with temples, with gods, with the dead, with the living, with the land itself. This interconnected existence defined not just life, but the possibility of eternal life beyond death. To be cast out was to be severed from this entire network of meaning. The desert, Deshret, the Red Land, represented everything Egypt was not. It was chaos to Egypt's order, death to Egypt's life, barrenness to Egypt's fertility. It was the domain of Set, god of chaos and foreigner, and of restless, harmful spirits. In Egyptian art, the desert was depicted not just as a physical landscape, but as a spiritual wasteland. To be exiled, there wasn't just geographical relocation. It was ontological demotion, a fall from ordered existence into chaos. Exile wasn't ordered casually. It was reserved for serious offenses that fell just short of capital crimes. Persistent corruption, blasphemy without direct harm, spreading falsehoods that damaged community trust, or being a dangerous political liability without having committed outright treason. Sometimes, exile served as an alternative to execution for those with valuable skills or noble connections, a mercy that often proved as final as the blade. A papyrus from the 19th dynasty describes the case of a treasury scribe named Amenemhat, who was caught falsifying accounts. Rather than execution, which would have been justified, he was sentenced to exile, beyond the eastern hills, never to return, never to be spoken of, his name unwritten. The document notes that this punishment was chosen because his knowledge of numbers makes his death wasteful, yet his presence cannot be tolerated among honest men. The preparation for exile was a ritual of erasure that began before the condemned ever stepped into the desert. First came the ceremony of separation from the two lands, typically conducted at a temple or administrative center. The exile's head would be shaved, not in the usual Egyptian style that left some hair, but completely, removing even the side lock that connected them to Horus. Their Egyptian clothes would be replaced with simple foreign garments, often made from undyed cloth. Most symbolically painful was the ritual of name erasure. In Egyptian belief, to exist was to have a name. The condemned would watch as their name was struck from family records, official documents, and any public inscriptions. In some cases, a clay tablet bearing their written name would be ritually broken before them. For high-profile cases, family members might be required to adopt new names to erase any connection to the banished. A Ramside text describes how one exiled official wept not at leaving his home, nor at surrendering his possessions, but broke into howling grief when the chisel struck his name from his father's offering stone. To be nameless was to be cosmically vulnerable, untethered from both community and afterlife protection. Next came the death before dying ritual. Since exiles were considered dead to Egypt, they underwent a perverse shadow of funeral rites. Instead of mummification that preserved for eternity, they might be symbolically wrapped in decaying palm leaves. Instead of opening of the mouth ceremonies that ensured the ability to eat and speak in the afterlife, their lips might be ceremonially sewn shut, then immediately reopened to symbolize their eternal silence in Egyptian memory. Some exile rituals included the breaking of a red pot inscribed with the person's crimes, a practice normally reserved for cursing enemies of Egypt. The message was clear. The exile was no longer Egyptian, but had become foreign, hostile, other. The psychological impact of being transformed from community member to cursed outsider, all while physically present to witness your own social annihilation, must have been devastating. The physical journey into exile was designed to reinforce this transition from life to living death. The condemned would be led to the desert boundary, often at a specific stone marker or boundary stele. They would be given minimal provisions, a small water skin, basic food, perhaps a simple weapon for defense against animals. The rations were calculated to allow them to reach the nearest non-Egyptian settlement, but just barely. Tomb paintings at Beni Hassan depict such a departure scene. The exile crosses a line carved in the sand, Egyptian guards watching with spears raised. Beyond the line, the painting shows stylized foreign lands populated by bent, misshapen figures, the Egyptian artistic convention for non-Egyptians, whom they considered literally malformed by existing outside Ma'at's perfect order. Once in the desert, the exile faced immediate physical challenges: scorching heat by day, bitter cold by night, scarce water, predators both animal and human. But these practical difficulties paled compared to the spiritual peril. Without access to proper religious practices, without temple blessings or protective amulets, without family tombs or embalming, the exile was believed to face not just physical death in the harsh landscape, but the second, permanent death of the soul. For an Egyptian, proper preparation for the afterlife began in youth and continued throughout life. Exile stripped away this entire framework of spiritual safety. The Egyptians believed that those who died in foreign lands, without proper rituals, faced a fragmented existence in the beyond, their ba, soul, unable to reunite properly with their ka, life force, leaving them as restless, unhappy shades rather than fully realized afterlife beings. Did exiles ever survive? Historical records suggest some did manage to establish new lives in neighboring lands, Nubia, Libya, or the Levant. A fascinating letter found at Deir el-Medina appears to be from such a survivor, written to his former family years after his banishment. He describes living among the sand people, likely Bedouin, having taken a foreign wife and learned their tongue. But his letter focuses primarily on his spiritual anguish. Though my body lives, my car wanders homeless. Though I eat, my soul starves. The letter contains desperate requests for small religious objects, a scarab amulet, a written spell from the Book of the Dead, suggesting that even years into his new physical life, his greatest concern remained his spiritual vulnerability. Most poignantly, he asks if his name still exists on his childhood dedication stele at the local Hathor temple. The letter has no recorded answer. Archaeological evidence for exile communities exists along Egypt's ancient borders. At sites like Zawiyet el-Rakam on the Libyan frontier and Tel Hebua in the Sinai, researchers have found curious hybrid settlements with Egyptian architectural elements, but distinctly non-Egyptian burial practices and household arrangements. These may represent communities of exiles who clustered together, creating syncretic cultures that preserved elements of Egyptian identity while adapting to their new reality. Some frontier settlements show evidence of what might be called exile religion, unofficial shrines with Egyptian deities represented in unorthodox ways, makeshift mummification attempts using available materials, and burial goods fashioned from non-Egyptian materials, but shaped into traditional Egyptian forms. These touching attempts to maintain spiritual connections reveal the depth of religious identity that persisted even in banishment. The rarest outcome for an exile was reintegration. In times of political upheaval, war, or succession crises, previously exiled individuals might be recalled if their skills or connections suddenly became valuable again. A stele from the late 18th dynasty records the return of a military architect who had been exiled 20 years earlier under the previous pharaoh. His reintegration required elaborate purification rituals, including symbolic rebirth ceremonies, where he passed through a cow's hide to emerge, newly born to Egypt. Such returns were the exception, however. For most, exile was a one-way journey into oblivion, a sentence that ensured they would be forgotten in this life and potentially lost in the next. In a culture where remembrance was immortality, enforced forgetting was the ultimate destruction. So next time you feel excluded from some social gathering or temporarily cancelled on social media, consider the exiles of ancient Egypt, ceremonially erased from existence, their names struck from memory, sent walking into the red wasteland, carrying nothing but the knowledge that their souls might wander hungry for eternity. Modern exclusion might sting, but at least it doesn't come with symbolic funeral rites and the breaking of your name tablet while your family is forced to pretend you never existed. As the exile vanishes into the shimmering desert heat, becoming smaller until they're nothing but a memory, Egypt will deliberately forget. Our journey through the punishments of this ancient civilization comes to its end. Let us turn now to reflect on what these elaborate, symbolic, and often terrible forms of justice tell us about the culture that created them, and perhaps about ourselves as well. As our exile disappears into the shimmering desert heat, leaving behind the ordered world of Egypt for the chaotic unknown, we too must now return from our journey through the shadows of ancient Egyptian justice. We've witnessed nose removal and impalement, sacred bulls and divine trials, poison chambers and boats of death. But what does this catalogue of creative cruelty tell us about the civilization that produced the pyramids, invented papyrus, and created some of humanity's earliest literature? Egyptian punishments, for all their brutality, weren't random acts of savagery. They were calculated, symbolic, and deeply integrated into a comprehensive worldview where justice wasn't merely a social construct, but a cosmic necessity. Unlike the public spectacles of Rome that we explored in our previous journey, designed primarily to entertain the masses while warning them, Egyptian punishments were fundamentally religious acts, restoring Ma'at, the divine order that sustained the universe itself. Every mutilation, every execution, every exile was a ritual realignment of cosmic forces. When a criminal's nose was removed, it wasn't just disfigurement. It was the visible marking of an internal spiritual imbalance. When a traitor was impaled, it wasn't just a painful death. It was the physical manifestation of how their actions had pierced the ordered heart of Egyptian society. The punishments were the visible symptoms of an invisible disease, the violation of Ma'at. This spiritual dimension made Egyptian justice distinctive among ancient civilizations. Mesopotamian law, codified in works like Hammurabi's Code, was primarily concerned with social order and compensation for damages. Greek justice focused on civic harmony and philosophical concepts of fairness. Roman punishment, as we've seen, emphasized state power and public deterrence. But Egypt's justice system was performing cosmic maintenance, keeping the very universe functioning through the careful removal of disruptive elements. The Egyptian concept that crime affected not just the victim, but the cosmic order, explains the elaborate nature of their punishments. If stealing merely harmed the owner of the stolen goods, a simple compensation might suffice. But if stealing disrupted the divine balance that kept the sun rising and the Nile flooding, then more comprehensive spiritual recalibration was required. Hence, the symbolic elements woven through every punishment. This worldview also explains why Egyptian punishments so often affected the afterlife, as well as mortal existence. When a convicted criminal was buried in the sand with honey-drawing insects, or when an exile was ceremonially erased from family records. These weren't just additional cruelties. They were acknowledgements that true justice extended beyond the brief span of earthly life into the eternal realm that mattered far more to ancient Egyptians. What's particularly fascinating is how Egyptian punishments evolved over their 3,000-year civilization. During the Old Kingdom, when the divine pharaoh's authority was absolute and unquestioned, punishments tended to be more straightforward, swift execution, or simple mutilation. As Egyptian society grew more complex during the Middle and New Kingdoms, with an expanding bureaucracy and priesthood, punishments became more elaborate, more symbolic, more ritualized, reflecting the increasingly sophisticated theological understanding of crime and consequence. The late period saw further refinement, particularly in the judiciary processes surrounding punishment. Divine trials became more procedurally complex, exile rituals more symbolically layered, and interrogation methods more psychologically sophisticated. Even as foreign influences, first Persian, then Greek, finally Roman, pressed upon Egypt, their punishment systems maintained distinctive Egyptian characteristics until the very end of pharaonic civilization. When we compare Egyptian punishments to those of Rome, which we explored previously, striking differences emerge. Roman punishments were public spectacles, designed for maximum visibility and impact on the watching crowds. Egyptian punishments, while sometimes public, were primarily concerned with their religious efficacy rather than their audience. Romans executed criminals in the arena to demonstrate state power. Egyptians executed criminals at symbolically significant locations to restore cosmic balance. Romans were pragmatic in their cruelty, focusing on deterrence and entertainment value. Egyptians were almost scholarly in their approach to punishment, developing complex symbolic systems that linked specific crimes to specific consequences. Where Rome roared with the crowd's approval of justice served, Egypt whispered prayers to ensure the gods witnessed justice performed. Yet despite these differences, both civilizations understood something fundamental about human society that perhaps we've forgotten. That punishment isn't merely about the criminal or even the victim, but about reaffirming the shared values that make collective existence possible. Whether through Rome's theatrical deterrence or Egypt's cosmic realignment, ancient punishments serve to remind everyone of the boundaries that defined their civilization. The archaeological evidence of Egyptian punishment practices, from specialized execution grounds to prison labor mining sites, from ceremonial reed test chambers to exile boundary markers, reminds us that justice systems require infrastructure. The Egyptians invested significant resources in their punishment apparatus, not because they were unusually cruel by ancient standards, they were actually rather measured, but because they believed proper punishment was worth doing properly, with appropriate ritual, setting, and expertise. This attention to detail extended to the personnel who administered justice. Egypt developed specialized roles we've encountered throughout our journey. The reed bearer, who knew precisely how much pain extracted truth without destroying the subject. The keeper of divine movements, who facilitated statue-based divine trials. The opener of ways, who performed exile rituals. These weren't mere executioners, but highly trained specialists, often with religious training, who understood their role in maintaining cosmic order. What, then, is the legacy of this complex system of ritualized punishment? Elements of Egyptian justice concepts survived long after the last hieroglyphs were carved. The idea that punishment should fit the crime, not just pragmatically but symbolically, influenced later Mediterranean legal traditions. The notion that justice has spiritual dimensions beyond mere social regulation informed religious legal systems from Judaism to Islam. Even the concept that punishment should restore balance rather than merely inflict suffering has echoes in modern restorative justice approaches. Perhaps the most important lesson from Egyptian punishment is the recognition that justice is never just about crime and punishment. It's about a society expressing its deepest values through the boundaries it enforces and how it enforces them. When we examine Egyptian punishments, we're really examining what they considered sacred enough to protect through the most extreme measures available to them. Cosmic order, religious truth, community trust, royal authority, and the integrity of the afterlife journey. So as we leave behind the reed-bearer's chamber, the execution grounds, the mines, and the desert exile paths, what do we take with us? Perhaps a more nuanced understanding of how justice systems reflect the cultures that create them. Perhaps a moment of gratitude that modern legal systems, for all their flaws, don't involve honey-covered burial or ritual name erasure. Or perhaps simply an appreciation for how the ancient Egyptians created a comprehensive vision of justice that seamlessly integrated the physical and spiritual, the earthly and cosmic, the immediate punishment and its eternal consequences. As you drift towards sleep, the ancient punishments of Egypt, fading like hieroglyphs in desert sand, consider how even the darkest aspects of human society, our methods of punishment and control, reveal our deepest beliefs about what matters, what lasts, and what it means to live in proper relationship with each other and the universe itself. Next time, we'll journey to yet another ancient civilization with its own unique approach to justice and punishment. Until then, may your dreams be free of reed bearers and crocodile trials, boat prisons, and nose removal. And may you never have to discover firsthand whether modern exile is truly less painful than its ancient Egyptian counterpart.